Boots slid on loose dirt as hands tightened around webbing, slick with sweat. Every step was uneven, every breath louder than the last. Somewhere in the middle of the formation, a man hung between them, his weight shifting with each stumble. No one asked how far it was, no one suggested setting him down. The only thing that mattered was keeping him off the ground and moving forward. Long before anyone spoke the words out loud, the decision had already been made. They were not leaving him behind. On October 25, 2007, soldiers from the 2nd Platoon Battle Company, 2nd Battalion, 503rd Infantry Regiment, 173rd Airborne Brigade moved on foot through the Korengal Valley in eastern Afghanistan. The terrain dictated everything. Steep ridgelines rose sharply on both sides of a narrow trail. Vegetation was thick in places, bare rock in others, offering concealment to anyone above the exposure to anyone below. The patrol was not unusual for the unit. The Korengal demanded constant presence, and movement through it was routine in the way only repeated danger can become routine. Everyone understood the risk. Everyone understood the ground favored the enemy. Specialist Josh Brennan moved with the platoon that day. Like most infantrymen in the unit, he was experienced, physically strong, and accustomed to carrying weight over bad terrain. Nothing about the patrol suggested it would be different from the many that came before it. The formation advanced along the trail in controlled spacing, maintaining security to the flanks and high ground as best they could. Radios crackled intermittently. Boots slid on loose rock. Visibility shifted constantly as the trail curved and narrowed. Then the ambush began. Enemy fire erupted from elevated positions along the ridgeline. The sound came first, sharp, overlapping cracks, followed by impacts snapping into rock and dirt around the platoon. The attack was coordinated and immediate, exploiting the terrain exactly as it had been designed to do. Specialist Brennan was hit early in the engagement and went down in an exposed section of the trail. The first attempts to reach Brennan were instinctive. Soldiers closest to him tried to move forward while others returned fire, attempting to suppress the enemy positions above. The volume of fire coming down the valley made movement dangerous and unpredictable. Brennan was still alive. That was clear from his movement and his voice. He was conscious, injured, and unable to move himself to cover. The location where he fell offered no protection from above, and every second he remained there increased the risk. Calls were made, positions were adjusted. The platoon fought to gain enough control of the terrain to reach him. This was not hesitation, it was necessity. Charging blindly would have meant more wounded on the same stretch of ground. At one point, Salvatore Giunta and another soldier pushed forward under fire and reached Brennan. They grabbed him and tried to drag him back toward cover. His equipment caught on the rocks. His weight worked against them. Enemy fire intensified as soon as they exposed themselves. They managed only a few yards. The fire was too heavy. Staying meant being pinned down with Brennan, turning a single casualty into multiple. They were forced to break contact and pull back. Brennan was left in place, not abandoned, but temporarily unreachable. The platoon continued fighting, shifting positions and returning fire in an effort to regain control of the ground. The goal never changed. Every movement was made with Brennan in mind. Then Giunta saw something that cut through the noise of the firefight. Through the chaos and movement of gunfire, Giunta saw two enemy fighters lifting Brennan by his arms and legs. They were not firing. They were carrying him away from the trail, down and away from the platoon's position. There was no pause to consider what it meant. Giunta later said the thought was immediate and simple. They were taking my friend. He moved forward without waiting for orders. Closing the distance under fire, Giunta engaged the two enemy fighters at close range, killing them both. Brennan dropped back to the ground where he had been moments before. Giunta reached him again, but this time he was not alone for long. Other soldiers moved forward as the platoon shifted fire to cover the recovery. Hands grabbed Brennan's gear. Someone took his rifle. Someone else pulled his pack free. They lifted him together, under fire, and began moving him back toward cover. The movement was fast, uneven, and dangerous. There was no clean formation, no measured pace, only urgency. Enemy fire continued as the platoon fought to keep the withdrawal from collapsing. They carried Brennan until they reached relative cover and could transfer him to medics. Josh Brennan would later be pronounced dead from his wounds. But in that moment, that outcome was not yet known. What mattered was that he was no longer alone on the ground in the Korengal Valley. What mattered was that the platoon had refused to let him be taken. They brought him back. Getting Brennan back to cover didn't end the fight. It changed its shape. Once he was out of the open, the platoon compressed around a smaller, more defensible piece of terrain. Fire was still coming in from above and across the valley, but now it was being answered with purpose. Soldiers redistributed ammunition without being asked. Fields of fire were adjusted. Radios came alive with short, clipped updates. Positions, movements, requests passed cleanly and without panic. Medics moved in on Brennan immediately. There was no ceremony to it. Packs came off. Hands worked fast. Someone shielded them while they worked. Body turned outward, rifle up. The sound of gunfire never fully faded, but it became background noise to the more urgent problem in front of them. The platoon fought to buy time. Every second mattered, not in an abstract sense, but in the very real calculation of how long they could hold before being forced to move again. The enemy still held the high ground. That hadn't changed. What had changed was resolve. The fight was no longer about breaking contact cleanly or advancing along a planned route. It was about keeping one wounded soldier alive long enough to get him out. Leadership during these minutes wasn't loud or centralized. Orders were given when needed, but most of the work happened laterally. Soldiers watching one another, filling gaps, stepping in before being told. No one needed to be reminded what the priority was. Despite the effort, Brennan's condition deteriorated. The wounds he'd taken early in the engagement were severe. The medics did what they could with what they had, under conditions that allowed for nothing resembling comfort or calm. When they finally had to stop, there was no dramatic announcement, just a quiet understanding that the fight for him was over. The firefight continued after that. The platoon still had to move, still had to disengage under pressure, still had to make it out of the valley without adding more names to the casualty report. Brennan's body was carried with them as they displaced, the same care taken now as before, not because anyone expected a different outcome, but because leaving him behind was never an option. When the firing finally tapered off and they reached a position where evacuation was possible, the exhaustion hit all at once. Legs shook, hands trembled, voices dropped. The adrenaline that had carried them through the worst of it drained away, leaving only the weight of what had happened. There was no celebration, no sense of victory or closure. Only the certainty that when the moment came, when it mattered most, they had moved toward one of their own instead of away. And that mattered, even if the outcome could not be changed. The firefight ended the way most do, not with a clear line between before and after, but with a slow thinning of sound. Individual shots replaced sustained fire, then only the wind moving through the trees and the scrape of boots on rock. When it was finally quiet enough to hear breathing again, the platoon took stock of itself. They were still in the Korengal Valley, still exposed, still responsible for one another. Brennan's body was secured for evacuation, the same care that had been used when he was alive carried through now, deliberate and precise. No one rushed it, no one treated it as routine. This was one of their own, and that fact didn't change just because the fight had moved on. The platoon continued to maneuver out of the area, carrying equipment, casualties, and the accumulated fatigue of the engagement. Muscles that had been running on adrenaline began to fail. Hands cramped, knees buckled on descents that would have been manageable an hour earlier. Every movement took more effort than it should have, and everyone felt it. Only now did the emotional weight begin to surface. There was anger, but it didn't have a clean target. The enemy was already gone. The terrain hadn't changed. There was grief, but it stayed controlled, packed down the same way everything else was. Infantry men are trained to finish the job before they process the cost. Word of what had happened began to move up the chain once radios were clear enough for longer transmissions. Names were spoken, timelines established, facts laid out. There was no embellishment. No one needed to explain why certain decisions had been made. Anyone who had been there already understood. In the days that followed, accounts of the engagement would be written, reviewed, corrected, and archived. Actions would be analyzed, statements would be taken. Eventually, recognition would come for some of what happened in that valley. But none of that existed yet. What existed were soldiers replaying moments they couldn't change. Seconds where they wondered if a different movement, a different angle, a different piece of terrain might have altered the outcome. Those questions didn't need answers to linger. They were simply part of the cost. What mattered, and what stayed clear even as everything else blurred, was this. When Brennan went down, no one accepted it as final. When he was taken, someone ran forward. When he had to be moved, hands closed around him and refused to let go. They did not win the fight that day. But they did what they could for as long as they could for one of their own. And for soldiers who measure themselves by that standard, that fact would endure long after the valley faded behind them. The Korengal didn't stay in the valley. When the patrol ended and the immediate demands of the fight were over, the engagement followed the platoon in quieter ways. It showed up in short, fragmented conversations and long silences, in the way certain details stayed sharp while others blurred completely. No one needed to talk about what had happened for it to remain present. Josh Brennan's death became official in paperwork and notifications, but among the men who had been there, it was already settled in memory. They remembered where he fell. They remembered how heavy he felt when they lifted him. They remembered the moment he was pulled back from the trail, and the moment they realized the fight for him was over. None of that required exaggeration. The facts were enough. As time passed, accounts of the battle were reviewed at higher levels. Actions were reconstructed from radio logs, statements, and after-action reports. The focus was tactical at first. How the enemy maneuvered, how terrain influenced the engagement, what could be adjusted for the next patrol. But threaded through all of this was the same constant detail, the effort to recover Brennan under fire. Eventually those details reached people far removed from the valley, officers who had never walked that trail, review boards operating in quiet rooms with maps instead of ridgelines. The language changed slightly as it moved upward, becoming more formal, more precise. Names were attached to actions, timelines were fixed. Recognition followed. For some of the soldiers involved, that recognition would come years later, long after the immediacy of the event had faded from public attention. Medals were awarded, citations were read aloud, the words were careful and exact, but they could never fully carry the weight of what had happened on the ground. For the men of the platoon, the meaning was already settled. They did not measure the day by what was written afterward or by what was eventually pinned to a uniform. They measured it by what they had done when a friend went down in a place designed to kill anyone who stopped moving. They remembered the choice that had been made without discussion, the movement forward when retreat would have been safer, the refusal to accept that the fight for one of their own was over until it truly was. Those moments followed them home, not as stories to be told loudly, but as fixed points, reference marks for who they were and what they would expect of themselves the next time it mattered. Because in the end, the Korengal wasn't remembered only for the fire or the terrain or the enemy. It was remembered for the simple, unchanging fact that when the moment came, they went back for him. Salvatore Giunta did not describe what he did that day as extraordinary. When asked about it later, he consistently framed it as a reaction rather than a decision, something that happened before he had time to think it through. In other words, he saw his friend being taken, and he moved. Anything more complicated than that came afterward. That distinction mattered to him. Giunta had been trained for combat. He understood fire and movement, suppression, terrain, and risk. He also understood fear. None of that disappeared in the Korengal. What happened, if only briefly, was the idea that he might do anything other than move forward. The calculation that usually governs survival, distance, angles, probability, collapsed into a single imperative. Josh Brennan was still there. In the moments after the fight, Giunta replayed that moment like everyone else who had been there replayed their own. He remembered how fast it happened, how little time there was between seeing Brennan being carried away and acting, how narrow the space was between success and failure. He remembered that there was no sense of bravery in it at the time, only urgency. When recognition came, Giunta struggled with the focus narrowing onto him alone. He pointed repeatedly to the platoon, to the men who covered his movement, to the soldiers who helped lift Brennan and bring him back. He made it clear that what happened in the Korengal was not a single man's story. It was a collective refusal to accept loss while there was still something that could be done. What stayed with him the most was not the firefight, but the aftermath. The quiet certainty that despite everything, the terrain, the enemy, the outcome, they had acted in accordance with the standard they held themselves to. They had gone back. They had not looked away. That understanding became heavier over time, not lighter. Giunta would carry the memory of Brennan forward into everything that followed his service, not as a source of pride, but as a point of orientation, a reminder that what mattered when things stripped down to their essentials, a reminder that courage, when it appears, often does so without announcement. For him, the story was never about running forward under fire. It was about not accepting that a friend was gone while there was still a chance to bring him back. Over time, the fight in the Korengal became something that existed mostly in records and memory. For people who were not there, it could be reduced to dates, locations, and citations. For those who were, it never simplified that way. It remained a sequence of moments, some sharp, some blurred, that refused to line up neatly into a lesson or a slogan. Josh Brennan's name was added to the list of those who did not come home. For his family, the story carried a different weight, shaped by loss rather than terrain or tactics. For the men of the 2nd Platoon, his absence showed up in quieter ways. An empty place in a formation, a missing voice in a conversation, a memory triggered by ground that looked just a little too familiar. What endured most was not the violence of the engagement, but the clarity of the response to it. When Brennan went down, no one paused to weigh his worth against the risk. No one framed the movement in terms of probability or survival statistics. The response was immediate and collective. They moved toward him because he was theirs. That was their entire calculation. This was the part of the war that rarely fits cleanly into explanation. It doesn't lend itself to abstraction or generalization. It exists at the level of individuals who know one another well enough that the line between self and group disappears under pressure. Years later, when people speak about courage in that valley, they often focus on the instant Giunta ran forward. But that moment only makes sense when viewed as part of something larger, a shared standard that didn't belong to one man alone. It belonged to a platoon that understood, without discussion, what was expected of them when the cost became personal. The story does not end with triumph. Brennan did not survive. The enemy was not decisively defeated. The Korengal remained dangerous long after that patrol ended. What that story leaves behind instead is simpler and harder to dismiss. Proof that even in a place designed to strip away choice, people still choose one another. That even when the outcome cannot be changed, the manner in which it is faced still matters. That is what stayed with them long after the valley faded from view. In the years that followed, the fight in the Korengal was revisited many times, usually in formal settings. Statements were reviewed, timelines were refined. The language used to describe what happened became precise and careful, shaped by policy and precedent. When Salvatore Giunta was awarded the Medal of Honor, the citation focused on specific actions: movement under fire, engagement of the enemy, recovery of his fallen soldier. Those details were accurate. They were also incomplete. For the men of the 2nd Platoon, the event was never stored as a citation or a headline. It lived in shared memory, reinforced every time they crossed paths afterwards. There was no need to retell the story in full. A glance, a short reference, or a single name was enough to bring it back. Brennan was remembered not for how he died, but for who he had been before the valley narrowed and the firing started. The way he moved, the way he carried himself, the ordinary competence that made him part of the background until suddenly he wasn't there anymore. That was the version of him that stayed. The recognition Giunta received was accepted with respect, but also with a clear understanding among those who had been present. Medals could not single out individuals. Memory did not. Everyone who had shifted fire, moved forward, lifted weight, or refused to disengage carried a share of the day. There was no bitterness in that understanding, just accuracy. As time passed, the Korengal became one deployment among many in a long war. New units rotated through, new names were added to reports. The valley itself did not change. What changed were the people who carried pieces of it with them, often without realizing it until years later. What endured was not a sense of loss alone, but a standard quietly reinforced, a confirmation of how they would respond when tested in the same way again. They did not remember the day as one where everything went right. They remembered it as a day when, under the worst conditions they could imagine, they acted in accordance with who they believed themselves to be. And that, for them, was how it was remembered. There's a temptation, when looking back on events like the fight in Korengal, to search for a clean takeaway, to turn it into an example, a lesson, or a symbol that fits neatly into a larger narrative about war. But the men who were there did not experience it that way, and the story resists being reduced to something tidy. Josh Brennan did not survive that day. The fact cannot be softened or reframed. No amount of courage or determination changed the final outcome. What did change, what mattered, was everything that happened before that outcome became unavoidable. When Brennan went down, the platoon did not treat his fate as settled. They did not decide that the situation was too dangerous or that the risk outweighed the effort. They acted on something older and simpler than doctrine or recognition. They acted on the belief that no one gets left behind where there is still a chance to bring them back. That belief is easy to say and hard to live by. In the Korengal, it meant moving forward into fire, lifting weight that slowed escape, and refusing to accept loss until every option was exhausted. It meant choosing responsibility over safety, even when the cost was real and immediate. This is why the story endures. Not because it ended well, but because it was faced honestly. Because the men involved did not measure their actions by outcome alone, but by effort and intent. Because they held themselves to a standard that did not change when the situation became unfair. Long after the terrain, the firefight, and even the names fade from public attention, that standard remains the quiet core of the story. It is not about a medal or a citation. It is about the moment when a group of soldiers, under pressure and without discussion, choose one another. They carried him back because he was theirs. And in doing so, they left behind a story that continues to matter, not as inspiration, but as proof of what people are capable of when they refuse to turn away. I'm Dave. I appreciate you watching. Please like, subscribe, comment, and share. And until next time, stand tall.
Oh, Dave.